Hey guys, I'm Kayla, the travel nurse. Today we're going to be discussing pay packages. So before I get into talking about blended rates, I really wanted to make sure I discuss with you guys guaranteed hours. Guaranteed hours in a contract are so critical. You need contracts with guaranteed hours, and here's why. Because if you don't have guaranteed hours, you are at a high risk of shift cancellation, and if the hospital can cancel you, they will. They will do it frequently. They will do it at every opportunity they can if their census is low or they're overstaffed, because they do not have to pay you that premium. So I have worked in places where my hours were guaranteed. This mostly happened out in California. California is like its own thing. They have their own laws and rules. They're really nice about that kind of stuff. But I had worked some contracts out there where I did get guaranteed hours, but I got put on call a lot, or I would work 4 hours of a shift and they would send me home early, or they would just straight up call me off, which is fine with me. Like, yeah, I'll stay home and get paid for doing nothing. Great for me. Bad for you, great for me. But just know that if your hours are guaranteed, it's a 50-50 gamble. Most of the time, the hospitals will not send you home early. They will not call you off, because their logic is, we're not going to pay you to sit at home and do nothing. Can't blame them for that. Other hospitals that are specifically unionized, I've seen for the most part, won't take hours away from their permanent staff. So they will call you, the traveler, off first. Again, which if you're guaranteed hours, cool. Now, if you're not guaranteed hours, then the less you work, the more you get called off, the less money you have coming in. Sometimes that can make it hard to pay your bills, make it hard to pay your rent, make it hard to just survive, especially if you're somewhere super expensive like in LA or New York, and you don't have that income stream rolling in steadily. That can make life a little bit more difficult for you. So just know that guaranteed hours are really, you should advocate for those. Your recruiter should be advocating for you for those. They definitely will make your life a lot easier and definitely give you more structure with your scheduling and with your work expectations and your paychecks. So you may hear a lot of terms regarding pay packages, such as blended rate, per diem, stipend, even GSA. So let's go ahead and explain what each of those is. So let's start with a blended rate. A blended rate is essentially your taxable hourly rate plus your non-taxable hourly rate. Meals, incidentals, and a housing stipend are all considered non-taxable pay. So in your contract, you'll most likely see those listed as a weekly rate. So in order to break that down hourly, we have to do a little bit of math. So let's do a little bit of math to help break this down and visualize what we're talking about. So if we have our taxable rate, we get $8.50 a week for housing and $1.50 a week for meals and incidentals. What we're going to do is we're going to add the $8.50 for housing, the $1.50 for meals and incidentals, to get a grand total of $1,000 per week of total tax-free stipends. Then we'll take our $1,000 per week, we'll divide it by our 36 hours per week contracted hours, and we're going to get a tax-free hourly rate of $27.78. Then we're going to add that tax-free amount to our $20 an hour taxable rate for a total gross blended hourly pay of $47.78. And before we continue, I gotta drink my pre-workout. Gotta get hyped for work tonight. Night shifters, you know how it is. All right, so now that we know what a blended rate is, let's figure out how they determine stipends. So there's something known as a GSA. The GSA is the General Services Administration. It's an independent agency of the government. Their job is to figure out the cost of living per zip code and then determine a maximum allowance for lodging, meals, and incidentals that can be given to travelers as they work away from their tax home. This money altogether is known as per diem or stipends. You'll see those terms used interchangeably amongst the companies, but they essentially mean the same exact thing. It just depends on what kind of wording you want to use to describe it. GSA table, I'm actually going to link it in the description box down below so you can easily access it anytime. And basically all you do is you'll enter your zip code and the appropriate tax year, and then it'll give you a table, and it'll clearly define the maximum allowances for housing, meals, and incidentals. And then that way you can determine, based on your contract terms, if the company is maxing out your allowances. Now, just because the GSA determines a maximum allowance does not mean that the company itself is going to give you the maximum allowance. And why is that? There's a couple reasons, but most simply stated is that it depends on the hospital bill rate. So what is a bill rate, you're gonna ask? The bill rate is the amount of money that the hospital and the company have agreed to pay you as the traveler. So in order to break down the bill rate and stipends, we're gonna do a little bit more math. Let's say the hospital bill rate is $75 an hour, the taxable rate is $25, and the max GSA allowable is $2,700 per week. Well, if we take $2,700 per week divided by 36 hours per week, that would be a GSA of $75. Now, if you're making $75 an hour maxed out GSA and your taxable rate is only $25 an hour, you add those together, that'd be $100 per hour going to you. Now remember, the hospital bill rate is $75 total per hour. So if the GSA is maxed out, according to the table, that would be $100 an hour. The company would take a $25 an hour loss. So the company has to decrease the GSA to $50 an hour plus your 25-hour taxable to max out at $75 an hour as a blended rate. Hopefully that makes sense. I know that can be a little confusing. Most of the time you are going to get maxed out or as close to maxed out as you can for those nice stipends, those allowances. But again, it just depends on the hospital bill rate. I'm also going to include a table courtesy of the IRS that breaks down the minimum taxable rates for earners of various filing statuses. So you'll see like the minimum tax you can pay is 10%. Looks like the maximum's about 37%. Most travelers will fall into that 22 to 30% range, depending on what your income is. So if you're taking tons of crisis contracts and you're making hella money for the year, you're gonna have a little bit of a higher tax bracket to fall into. But on average, anything between 22 and 30% tends to be a safe number. And I just go with the 30% when I'm doing the math and my calculations, because usually I fall around 6 to 28%. So I just overestimate just a little bit. So I'm also going to link that table down below in the description box so you can access that as well if you'd like to look at that more in depth. I also wanted to mention that if you have company provided insurance, I think on average what I've seen is most of the companies charge anywhere from, like $60 to $85 a week for insurance. So don't forget to deduct that amount. So bottom line, what should you be looking at regarding pay as a traveler? I personally like to know my blended rate. I like to see everything broken down individually, but I like to do the math and I like to know what my blended rate is, because that is the amount of money that will hit your bank account every Friday. So it makes life a lot simpler to know what to anticipate. But just remember that all of your pay is going to be listed as gross. So you have to do more math to figure out what your net weekly take home is. So when you're calculating tax withholdings, a good number to use is 30%. That seems to be the average for tax withholding, but depending on the zip code, depending on the hospital location, depending on whatever the IRS decides to factor in there, sometimes there's a variable of 22% to 30%, sometimes even a little higher than 30%, but on average, it's 30%. I do want to give you two examples of calculating your net pay. One is manual with just good old math, and then the other way is this really amazing app that gets you darn near close to your estimated weekly net take-home pay. So you can choose which way you'd like to go with it or use one to confirm the other. So if we take our example from the first math equation, and we're making $20 an hour taxable, and we factor in a 30% tax withholding, that would be $6 in taxes, which would make our net pay hourly $14. So what we can do is we can then take our tax-free money, which is the $27.78 per hour, add the 14 to it, and we would have a total net pay of $41.78 per week. Multiply that by 36 hours a week, and then you get your estimated weekly take home every Friday. So it requires a little bit of math.
Talk about the Paycheck Calculator app. Thank you to one of my fellow Redditors on the travel nursing subreddit for mentioning this, but it allows you to take your gross pay and estimate all of your tax withholding and then shows you what your net pay could be. It's a wonderful estimate and it can back up the math that you're doing and so that it's comparable so that you know you're on the right track. So this is a wonderful tool to use and you can use this tool solely if you choose. Okay, so what I did is I took my hourly mode and put it in, put my pay frequency as weekly. I put 40 hours worked every week, and then my hourly rate was $119. Then I went ahead and put in my tax withholding information, such as I'm single, working in Florida with one allowance. Then what I did is I went ahead and I put in my overtime rate, which is 8 hours every single week to make a 48-hour contract, and that hourly rate is my overtime rate. And then from here, I added a taxable rate and then my non-taxable weekly rate into the program, which will help determine what gets taxed and what doesn't up at the top. And you put in your gross income at the top, and it does all the math and calculations on the estimated tax withholding. The non-taxable rate isn't showing up at the top, but it is adjusted accordingly, and there's no state income tax in Florida, so that's automatically adjusted.
You can do like some people and just be surprised when you get that first paycheck. Your company will always list your pay as gross pay. Right now we're seeing tons of crisis contracts that say, they're paying, like $5,000 a week. But you still have to do math on that $5,000 because you have to know what your taxable rate, what your non-taxable rate is. So $5,000 isn't always $5,000. So just keep that in mind. And this just gives you a good idea of what to expect, so that there aren't surprises. You're not disappointed by your paycheck, which happens sometimes when your taxable rate is really high. It does happen, but it is better to use that 30% model, and then that way if you are being taxed slightly less, like 25 or 28%, then your paycheck's a little bit more than you expected, which is nice because then you're not overestimating what you should be getting deposited every Friday. And this is why it's so good to know the breakdown of the pay. In most companies, I don't want to say all because everyone does things differently, but most companies will break it down by your taxable hourly, your housing stipend, and then your meals and incidentals. So you have all these numbers. You just put them all together and do the math. I'll see you guys in the next video. Good luck and happy travels. Slides, do the math, blah, 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 voiceover.